This is On the Ground, onthegroundshow.org, Voices of Resistance from the Nation's Capital. I'm Esther Iverum. And now I'm joined by our geopolitical analyst, the prolific author and activist Gerald Horne, professor of history and African American studies at the University of Houston. The most recent of his more than 40 books is The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Welcome back to the show, Gerald.
Thank you.
Well, that provocative trip to Taiwan by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, which we discussed 2 weeks ago, actually did happen this week, with Pelosi traveling on a military plane, no less, slipping into Taiwan late Tuesday night, with details of this trip kept a close secret until the last minute. And so while she was there, she met with Taiwanese leaders and gave a speech in which she repeated the latest, I call them U.S. empire talking points. Quote, the world faces a choice between democracy and autocracy, end quote. And quote, America's determination to preserve democracy here in Taiwan and around the world remains ironclad, end quote. I should also say that she was met with protesters. I saw one group on Twitter hurling epithets at her. And so there was way too much happening this week to cover quickly, but let's start by you giving us your top line thoughts on Pelosi's misadventure.
Well, I don't think you can understand this escapade without understanding her district, which covers most of the city of San Francisco, has one of the largest Asian American populations of any congressional district, mostly Chinese Americans, and like the Cuban American population of South Florida, many of whom have roots in the fleeing from the revolution of 1959. Likewise, a disproportionate percentage of the Chinese American community in Pelosi's district have roots in the fleeing from the Chinese Revolution of 1949. But obviously, Washington is miscalculating because they're tending to drive China and Russia together. You may have seen the comment from the Russian authorities offering assistance to their Chinese comrades in confronting U.S. imperialism in the South China Sea. And Washington might be aware of that because, not being reported heavily, is the fact that the nuclear talks with Iran in Vienna have resumed, and the U.S. negotiator Robert Malley is jetting to Austria as we speak, because there was a gathering apprehension that the United States was also driving Iran, China, and Russia into each other's arms. But we really should warn the hotheads in Washington about something they should already know, which is of the 19 tabletop exercises that have been conducted by the Pentagon, so-called war games, where the United States confronts China, that the United States have lost all 19 of those exercises. Washington should also be aware of the fact that China is being pressured from below to react strongly. This idea of a century of humiliation endured by China from the 1840s, when the British forced opium on China, till the Chinese Revolution of 1949, that's felt deeply and sincerely by the Chinese masses and working class, and they're pressuring the Communist Party to react more strongly. And then, of course, Washington should be aware that China has a number of cards to play. Already, we have received news that they may be curtailing agricultural purchases from Midwestern farmers, which will not go down very well, I'm afraid to say, during the midterm congressional elections. And then we know that the People's Bank of China has been reducing its purchases of Treasury bills from the U.S. Treasury Department. Those are basically loans to Washington to prop up everything from the Pentagon to the post office. For the first time in a decade, those Treasury bills purchases have fallen below about $1 trillion. Likewise, Taiwan, the rebel province that China calls its own, which only has a population of 23 million, it's heavily dependent on the Chinese economy. And in light of the fact that this week, China will basically be encircling the island and engaging in live fire in terms of military exercises, may curtail exports from Taiwan, not to mention imports. And that may also help to drive a lesson home to the U.S. economy, because a major export from Taiwan are these computer chips. The Taiwanese computer chips manufacturers are some of the most significant on planet Earth. And in fact, we've already received reports that a dearth of computer chips has led to a shutdown of assembly lines in Michigan, for example, for the building of cars. And that sheds light on the recent CHIPS Act passed by Congress, which Bernie Sanders called corporate welfare, which it is, which is going to subsidize the manufacturing of chips in this country. And in fact, Taiwanese chips manufacturers are about to build major plants in the United States, as well as Samsung of South Korea. I should also mention, finally, that it was quite a remarkable and vulgar display by Congressman Gregory Meeks of the Congressional Black Caucus, chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He accompanied Speaker Pelosi. And I don't know if you saw the footage when they landed in Taiwan. He was acting like Marcel Marceau. I mean, he was acting like a mime. Speaker Pelosi would wave, he would wave. She'd take a step back, he would take a step back. I don't know if he was afraid of being mistaken for security, or maybe he was just illustrating how he's like a robot when it comes to tailing after Speaker Pelosi. But it was quite an insult to his congressional district in Southeast Queens. And I hope that they have paid attention to his disgusting display.
Right, especially since this follows this legislation that he sponsors that basically tries to penalize African countries for failing to fall in line behind this, the U.S. imperialist moves in Ukraine, and also this U.S. targeting of Ethiopia and its sovereignty. So it makes sense that it was Jeffrey Meeks. But in terms of the chips, I do know that Pelosi, while she was there, she had a meeting with, I think, Mr. Liu of the TSMC. This is the chip, big chip maker in Taiwan. And she spoke to him about this legislation here that is trying to subsidize, chip manufacturing here in this country. So I mentioned that because there was a lot of speculation about, what is this trip accomplishing? Why are you going over there, Nancy Pelosi, and causing all of this international upset without even any goal, right? So was that her goal, to try to make some special deal with this chip manufacturer in Taiwan?
In part, and also it was to placate and appeal to the right-wing Chinese American community in her San Francisco district. Plus, we all know that she has a long history of trying to bait Beijing. Recall some decades ago, she showed up in Tiananmen Square and unfurled a banner that Chinese interpreted as insulting and hurting the feelings of the Chinese people, and then fled into the night. So Speaker Pelosi supposedly will be stepping down soon. She's 82 years old. If the Republicans reclaim the House, which very well may happen, you can expect that. And even if they don't, it may be time for her to go.
Right. Well, it's interesting you said that she kind of fled after her other display in Tiananmen Square, because people noted that, her plane arrived about 10:45 p.m., kind of like a thief in the night, and that it was, even though it was on a military plane, it was not a bold display of, as if she was trying to come in the full daylight and make a grand entrance. Well, I want to shift gears and go to some domestic issues. Of course, people are still talking about this raid. Almost a week ago, the FBI raided properties of the African People's Socialist Party and affiliates in St. Louis, Missouri, and in St. Petersburg, Florida. The leader of the party, Chairman Omali Eshatella, who we have interviewed on this show, said agents showed up around 5 a.m. to the group center in St. Louis, where he lives, with at least one armored vehicle. He said they tossed flash grenades, broke windows, sent a drone into his house, and forced he and his wife, Ona Zene Eshatella, out of the house at gunpoint. So apparently, the FBI told reporters that these raids were in connection with an ongoing investigation of a Russian national, Alexander Viktorovich Ionov. And he's founder and president of the anti-globalization movement of Russia. And they're claiming that the African Socialist Party was involved in and Russian disinformation being distributed in this country because they were involved in this anti-globalization movement, had attended meetings in Russia of this movement, and was involved in these types of anti-globalization efforts. So, when I read these accounts, I thought of our conversations about how you said in the 1950s and 60s, the groups like the NAACP kind of made this bargain that Black people aren't supposed to have like international relations and international solidarity because we're supposed to, trade all of that for so-called civil rights, voting rights, the right to sit on the front of the bus, the rights to go to any restaurant we want, and that was the kind of devil's bargain made, and that so much of the leadership or so-called leadership in Congress and in these organizations are sticking to that. So the FBI feels it has a right to attack Black people for seeking international solidarity.
Well, in the interest of full disclosure, I should mention to begin with that for a number of years now, I've been a weekly commentator on the African People's Socialist Party and their affiliate, the Uhuru movement, on their radio station in St. Petersburg, Florida. Now, before left sectarians and nervous liberals call the FBI to drop a dime on me, so they'll send a battering ram to my door and drones accompanied by flash grenades and jackbooted cops ready to beat me across the head with reckless abandon. I should also mention that, as you know, I cooperate with many left and Black nationalist formations, which I will not enumerate. But I think that the larger point is what you suggest. That is that the Republicans, as they are doing this week, can invite Viktor Orban, the neo-fascist leader from Budapest, Hungary, to Texas to address those assembled there, just like Vice President Michael Pence, Tucker Carlson of Fox News, and others have been making regular pilgrimages to Budapest to sup at Mr. Orban's table. And what's frightening about that is that just in the last week or so, one of his top advisors resigned because Mr. Orban began citing rhetoric of Hungarian fascists of the 1930s. And the opinion of analysts was that he was doing that in order to appeal to his Texas audience.
Wow.
Which is a sobering thought, to put it mildly. And we need not rehearse what we've been talking about for weeks, which is the Israeli lobby, which intervenes regularly in U.S. domestic affairs, helping to defeat Donna Edwards in Maryland, Nina Turner in Cleveland, Andy Levin, their latest victim, a sitting congressman from Michigan.
Right, the most progressive Jewish congressman, a former leader of a synagogue, because he doesn't mind standing up for the rights of the Palestinian people.
So, yes, and that's not to mention the aforementioned Gregory Meeks and all of his misdeeds, and not to mention Bakari Sellers, the Black American CNN commentator who tried to defeat Rashida Tlaib in Detroit and failed. And as you suggested, it's not only what happened in the 1950s, our internationalism as embodied by Paul Robeson, who became a sacrificial lamb after the NAACP decided to cut this Faustian bargain with the U.S. ruling class, but it goes back to the bad old days of slavery. When London and Washington were at swords' point, we found Frederick Douglass in and out of London much more so than Robeson was in and out of Moscow in the 1930s and 1940s. And so this is a very dangerous signal that the FBI sent we should realize as well that it's utterly specious, because we also know that if the Russians say that they're against tooth decay and we say we're against tooth decay, that means ipso facto that we're Russian agents. We cannot take positions that the Russians might agree with. So if we say we're for reparations and the Russians say they're for reparations, that means that we're Russian agents. If we say we're against this sanctions maneuver against Moscow because of Ukraine, and obviously Moscow says the same thing, that means that we're Russian bots. So this is ludicrous. It's a danger to free speech, a danger to the First Amendment, and all progressive forces should speak up in one voice against it.
Absolutely. So I know we don't have much time, but I caught just a piece of a Senate hearing on this week. I think it might have been Wednesday, about the Electoral Count Act. And this is legislation that the Democrats are trying to pass in reaction to the attack on the Capitol on January 6, 2021. So I wanted you to just kind of give people a little background on that, because in the past, we've talked about the period of Reconstruction, and this act was developed after the contested elections, which had a lot to do with Black people in the South being enfranchised and then disenfranchised after Reconstruction, and the attempt to have a peaceful election that the slaveocracy could cooperate with. So why don't you just tell us briefly about the origins of this Electoral Count Act and what you think about it right now in terms of what's happening right now.
It comes in the aftermath of the contested election of 1876, which represented a blow to Reconstruction and Black people's voting rights, insofar as the deal that was cut allowed federal troops to be removed from Dixie, which allowed the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorists to run amok, lynching and killing Black people, depriving us of voting rights. Now, the Electoral Count Act, recently introduced by Senators Susan Collins and Joseph Manchin, is trying to clarify what process takes place when the electoral vote, is counted on January 6th, trying to prevent another effort that you saw take place on January 6, 2021, when Mr. Trump was pressuring Vice President Michael Pence to toss out certain electoral college counts. And the new act by Collins and Manchin is trying to clarify that the vice president's role is solely ministerial. And so that means that they have no power. They just are counting. Now, the Republicans are in favor of this, I believe, because on January 6, 2025, irrespective of who wins, it will be Vice President Kamala Harris in the position of Michael Pence. And I don't think that Kamala Harris would try to engage in any shenanigans, because the right wing is too strong in this country. But in any event, this Electoral Count Act would clarify that her role is, as noted, ministerial. Having said that, I think that this Electoral Count Act has been overtaken by events. We know from recent news revelations that not only was the Secret Service perhaps involved in this attempted coup. Look at the letters from Congressman Benny Thompson of Mississippi and Carol Maloney of New York, which are raising serious and searching questions about their misfeasance in terms of handling text messages and purging text messages. But the latest revelation is that Pentagon leaders as well have deleted texts that they were not supposed to delete, that they knew they were not supposed to delete. Number one, I trust and I hope that technological wizards can recover these lost texts. But point number two is that this attempted coup might have been much deeper than many of us suspected. And point number three is that I hope Mr. Biden is watching his back, because apparently the Secret Service has been penetrated. It's full of Trumpistas and cannot be trusted.
All right. Well, I know that in terms of the Electoral Count Act and this raid on the African Socialist Party, it just really points to the connection between the historical effort to undermine, Black political power, the Black freedom movement. And so all of these stories are stories that we're going to continue to cover here on the ground. I want to thank our geopolitical analyst for joining us today, Professor Gerald Horne, Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston.